My son said coldly, "You've lived long enough." I felt ignored, discarded, and treated like a burden. But he didn't expect my final decision. "My name is Margaret. I'm 67 years old, and I'm the mother of Michael, who's 42. And for you to better understand this real story, I'm going to tell you how it all began." You know that moment when you feel the ground disappear from under your feet? Well, that's exactly what happened to me on a completely ordinary Thursday afternoon. I was in the living room, organizing some papers, when my son Michael walked in with that look of someone who needs to have a serious talk. There wasn't any shouting, no apparent drama. Everything was so calm, almost too polite, you know? And it was precisely that calmness that scared me from the start. He sat down on the couch, looked at me with a coldness I'd never seen before, and started talking about reorganizing priorities. In that instant, something inside me already knew that what would come next would change everything forever. The words came out of his mouth as if they were just facts, without any emotion whatsoever. "Mom, you've lived long enough. Now I need to think about my future, my family." I swear I tried to process that, but my brain just froze. What do you mean, lived long enough? What exactly did that mean? I looked at my ungrateful son's face, trying to find some sign that this was a bad joke, but there was nothing. His eyes were empty, as if he were talking about trading in a car or renovating the house. And there, beside him, was Jennifer, my gold-digger daughter-in-law, watching everything in silence. She didn't say a word, but that slight smile at the corners of her mouth spoke louder than any scream. In that moment, I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. It wasn't just rejection, it was something much worse. It was as if I'd become a burden, an obstacle in his path to happiness. All those memories of the sacrifices I'd made flashed through my head like a fast-forward movie. The sleepless nights when he had a fever, the 2 jobs to pay for his college, the dreams I left behind so he could achieve his. And now, there he was, telling me I'd lived long enough. As if my life had an expiration date, like a grocery store product that needs to be thrown out before it spoils. Jennifer continued with that discreet smile, and I realized this wasn't news to her. I tried to speak, but the words simply wouldn't come out. My throat was closed, as if someone were squeezing from the outside. Michael kept talking about financial planning, about how he needed to focus on his own family now. Each word was a stab. He spoke as if I were no longer part of that family, as if I were just an uncomfortable reminder of the past. And Jennifer? She just nodded her head now and then, reinforcing each cruel argument that came out of my son's mouth. In that moment, I understood something terrible. That conversation had already happened before, just without me present. They'd already discussed this, planned this approach, rehearsed these words. The total humiliation I felt in that instant was different from anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't public shame. There wasn't an audience, but it was worse, because it came from inside my own home, from my own flesh and blood. I looked around the living room, the same living room I'd decorated with so much care, where we'd spent so many happy moments when he was a child. Now that space seemed strange, hostile. Michael finished his speech and stood there looking at me, waiting for me to say something. Jennifer crossed her legs, still with that air of superiority, as if she were watching a soap opera scene. I opened my mouth, but all I managed was an almost inaudible, "I understand." It wasn't true. I didn't understand anything, but I also didn't have the strength to argue at that moment. They got up and left shortly after, leaving a heavy silence in the air. I stood there, stopped in the middle of the living room, trying to process what had just happened. Had I heard right? Had my own son really told me I'd lived long enough? The pain was so intense I couldn't even cry. It was as if my body were in shock, denying reality to protect itself. I looked at his photo on the shelf, the one we took at his college graduation. His smile was so genuine that day. Where did everything change? When exactly did I become a nuisance in my own son's life? Night fell, and I remained sitting in the same spot, unable to move. My mind was at war, trying to justify his words, looking for some explanation that wouldn't hurt so much. But there wasn't one. The raw truth was that my ungrateful son had reduced me to a problem to be solved, to an inconvenience in his planning. And Jennifer, that gold-digger daughter-in-law, was there to make sure I understood my new place, or rather, my lack of place. I thought about calling him, trying to explain how much those words had hurt me, But something inside me, a voice I barely recognized, said, "No, it won't help. He knows exactly what he said and how it hurt you." That's when something began to change inside me. It wasn't anger, at least not right away. It was a kind of cold clarity, a cruel lucidity that comes when you finally see the truth that's been hidden all along. I dedicated my entire life to this son, had completely erased myself to ensure he had everything. And in the end, all I got back was a, "You've lived long enough." That phrase echoed in my head non-stop, like an annoying song you can't get out of your mind. But along with the pain, something different began to grow, a determination I'd never felt before. Maybe he was right about one thing. It was time to think about myself. I got up from the couch when it was almost midnight. My body ached from being in the same position for so long. I went to the kitchen to get a glass of water and saw my reflection in the window glass. Who was that woman? When had I stopped recognizing myself? Her eyes were tired, but there was something new there too, a spark of rebellion perhaps, or maybe just the beginning of a bitter acceptance. As I drank the water, I realized that hadn't been the first time Michael had treated me as disposable. But before, they were small things, loose comments, impatience disguised as concern. Jennifer had come into his life 3 years ago, and since then everything had been changing little by little. But I was too busy trying to be the perfect mother to notice I was being pushed out of my own son's life. I went back to the living room and sat down again, but this time with a notebook and a pen. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do, but I felt I needed to start organizing my thoughts. I wrote the date at the top of the page, and below it, that damned phrase, "You've lived long enough." Seeing that on paper made everything even more real, more definitive, but it also gave me a strange sense of control. It was as if, by writing it down, I was acknowledging the wound so I could start treating it. I looked at that phrase for a long time, and then wrote underneath, "Maybe I have, but not in the way he thinks." In that moment, something inside me began to reorganize itself. The pain was still there, intense and suffocating, but along with it, a desire began to be born to prove that my life still had a lot of value, only this time, the value would be measured by myself. I closed the notebook and went to bed, but sleep didn't come. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about all the times I'd stroked Michael's head, all the times I'd overlooked his failures, his rudeness, his growing ingratitude. I'd justified everything by saying he was stressed, that work was tough, that Jennifer was pressuring him. There was always an excuse, always a way to avoid facing the truth. But now there was no more running away. My son had said, in so many words, that I was a burden. And Jennifer had silently agreed, with that knowing smile that still made me nauseous just thinking about it. The emotional story I'd always imagined having with my son, that special connection between mother and son that I saw in movies, had revealed itself to be an illusion. And now I needed to decide what to do with this painful truth I just discovered. In the days following that devastating conversation, I couldn't stop thinking about how I'd gotten there. You know, when you start reviewing your entire life, trying to find the exact moment when everything fell apart? Well, that's what I did. I spent hours remembering each sacrifice, each choice I'd made, thinking of Michael's well-being. And the more I thought about it, the more it hurt to realize that none of it had mattered to him. It was like discovering you'd built an entire house with your own hands, brick by brick, only for someone to come along and say that house never existed. The feeling of emptiness was so great that sometimes I needed to sit down because my legs simply wouldn't support me. How can entire years of dedication be erased with a single sentence? I remember like it was yesterday, the day Michael's father left. He was only 3 years old, so small he barely understood what was happening. I held that little boy in my arms and promised he'd never lack for anything, that I'd be both father and mother at the same time. And I tried. God knows I tried. I'd wake up at 5 in the morning to work as a secretary at an accounting firm, rush home at lunchtime to feed him, and at night I'd still clean at a law office. It was 16, sometimes 18 hours a day of work. My feet were always swollen. My back hurt so much I could barely get out of bed. But when I looked at his little sleeping face, I thought it was all worth it. How naive I was, right? Michael's teenage years were a complicated phase, as they are for most boys. But I always overlooked everything, always found justifications. When he'd yell at me because I couldn't buy the brand name sneakers his friends had, I'd swallow my tears and work extra hours. When he'd get detention at school for talking back to teachers, I'd go there, apologize for him, promise I'd talk to him at home. And I would talk, always with patience, always trying to understand his side. My dreams? Oh, those kept getting stored in a dusty drawer. I'd always wanted to go to college for education, you know? I loved children, had a special way with them. But how could I study when I barely had time to breathe? His future always came before my present. When it was time for college, things got even tighter financially. Michael wanted to study business administration at a private university, and not just anyone. It had to be the best in the city, of course. I looked at the tuition and felt my chest tighten. There was no way to pay for that, not with my salary. But there was also no way to say no to him, not after everything I'd promised. That's when I started doing freelance typing work in the early morning hours. I'd sleep 3, sometimes 4 hours a night. My health started showing signs it couldn't keep up that pace for much longer. High blood pressure, constant pain, chronic fatigue. But I ignored everything. After all, it was all for my son, right? For the bright future he deserved to have. During his 4 years of college, I practically didn't live. I worked like a convict to pay tuition, books, materials, even his outings with friends. Because Michael said networking was important, that he needed to keep up appearances, and I believed it. I believed every word, every justification. Meanwhile, my teeth needed treatment I didn't get, my glasses had an outdated prescription because there wasn't money left to go to the eye doctor, my clothes were the same ones for years. But that's okay, I thought. He'll graduate, get a good job, and then everything will get better. He'll see it was worth it. He'll recognize everything I did for him. How stupid I was to believe that. His graduation was one of the happiest days of my life, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I was so proud, dressed in that simple dress I'd bought, especially for the occasion. I took photos, cried with emotion, hugged him saying how proud I was. And him? He thanked me quickly, more worried about taking pictures with friends, about going to the party happening afterward. He didn't even invite me, actually. Said it was just for the classmates, and that I wouldn't feel comfortable there. I pretended I understood, that everything was fine. But it was already a sign, wasn't it? A sign I refused to see. I went home alone that night, looked at the photo we'd taken together, and tried to ignore that little chill in my stomach that said something was wrong. After graduation, Michael got a good job at a multinational company. I was so happy for him. I thought I could finally slow down a bit, take care of my health, maybe even realize some of my postponed dreams. But that's not quite how things worked out. He still needed help, to buy a decent car, to furnish his new apartment, to maintain the standard he thought was appropriate. And I kept helping, of course. After all, he was starting his life. He needed support. I understood, or at least tried to understand. What I didn't understand was why he never said thank you, why it always seemed like that was my obligation, not a favor. But I swallowed those thoughts, threw them under the rug along with all the other discomforts. It was around that time that Jennifer appeared in his life. Right from the start, I noticed she had a calculated way about her, you know? She always asked about my savings, about whether I had any property, about retirement plans. She asked questions disguised as concern, but I could see the calculator working in her head. I tried to talk to Michael about it once, subtly, but he got furious, said I was controlling, that I couldn't accept seeing him happy, that Jennifer was the best thing that had happened to him. And I, as always, apologized. I kept helping financially, kept being the elderly mother who was there to serve when they needed. The gold-digger daughter-in-law was poisoning the relationship little by little, and my ungrateful son let it happen. More than that, he collaborated. Their marriage was another blow. I offered the little I'd saved to help with the party, thinking it would be a nice gesture. Jennifer looked at the amount and made a face, as if it were charity, said it was better to keep that money because it wouldn't even cover the catering. Michael didn't defend my gesture, didn't value my effort. He just agreed with her. Right there, I should have realized I'd lost my son. But no, I kept insisting, kept trying to be part of his life. I'd go to their house every week, bring food, help with cleaning, take care of things they didn't have time for. And every time I arrived, Jennifer had that look of someone measuring my usefulness, as if I were an employee, not her husband's mother. In the last 2 years, things kept getting more and more tense. Michael started making excuses not to see me. He was busy, had commitments, needed time for himself. Jennifer always reinforced that I was controlling too much, that I needed to give the couple space. And the worst part is she'd say this to my face without any shame, and Michael never contradicted her. I started feeling like an intruder in the life I'd built for him myself. Each visit was uncomfortable. Each phone call was received with impatience. But I kept trying, because mothers don't give up on their children, right? At least that's what I believed. Until that Thursday afternoon, when he finally said out loud what he'd been showing for a while, that I'd lived long enough, that now it was his turn. As if our lives were a competition, and not a story of love and care that should last forever. Sitting there on the couch, remembering all of this, I finally understood a cruel truth. My love had turned into convenience for him. I was no longer the mother. I was the source of resources, the problem solver, the emotional and financial crutch he used when he needed it. And Jennifer knew that. She'd realized from the beginning that I was useful, but disposable. And she'd worked methodically to make Michael see it the same way. Years of sacrifice, of giving up everything, of completely erasing myself. And for what? To hear that I'd lived long enough to be treated like a nuisance. In that moment, something inside me started to crack for good. It wasn't just pain. It was a silent rage, an indignation that was starting to boil slowly. And I knew I couldn't continue like this. But what would happen next? I didn't even imagine yet. If I thought that conversation in the living room had been rock bottom, I was very wrong. Because 2 weeks after that terrible day, something happened that made me realize humiliation can always go down another step. It was at my sister Carol's birthday, a family lunch she insisted on organizing every year. I almost didn't go, to be honest. After that phrase from Michael, I'd spent the days isolating myself, avoiding everyone. But Carol insisted so much, said it would be good for me to get out a little, see other faces. And I, idiot, still carrying a spark of hope, thought that maybe in front of the family, Michael would act differently, that maybe all that coldness was just a phase, a moment of stress. How wrong I was. I arrived at Carol's house trying to seem normal, smiling and greeting everyone. Michael and Jennifer were already there, sitting on the living room couch with other cousins. When they saw me, he waved slightly and Jennifer didn't even do that. She just raised her eyebrow in a kind of forced acknowledgement. I swallowed the discomfort and went to help Carol in the kitchen, trying to keep myself busy. But deep down, I knew something bad was about to happen. It was that feeling in your stomach, that premonition you try to ignore, but that's never wrong. And in fact, it wasn't wrong. Because at lunchtime, when everyone was sitting at the table talking and laughing, the subject turned to family, as it always does at gatherings like this. My cousin Helen, who's kind of a gossip but without malice, started talking about taking care of elderly parents. She'd just put her mother in a very good nursing home and was telling how difficult it had been to make that decision. But it's what's best for her, Helen was saying. We don't have the structure to care for her at home. We work all day. It's complicated. Everyone listened carefully, giving opinions, sharing experiences. I was quiet, moving the food around on my plate, when I felt Jennifer's gaze fixed on me. I raised my eyes and saw her whisper something in Michael's ear. He gave a knowing little smile and cleared his throat. My heart raced. I just knew something horrible was about to happen. Speaking of which, Michael began, and everyone turned to him. Jennifer and I were talking about this the other day too, about the natural cycle of life, about respecting each person's time. He looked directly at me as he spoke, and I felt my face start to heat up. Jennifer had that corner-of-the-mouth smile, the one I'd learned to hate. Mom's lived quite a bit, done everything she had to do. Now it's time for her to accept that she needs to make room for the new generation, you know? She can't keep wanting to control everything forever. The silence that fell over the table was deafening. Everyone stopped eating, talking, breathing. And me, I wanted the earth to open up and swallow me right there. "Michael!" Carol exclaimed, shocked. "What kind of comment is that?" But he wasn't fazed. On the contrary, he continued as if he were talking about the weather or traffic. "It's the truth, Aunt. We need to be realistic. My mom already had her phase. Now she needs to understand that the world keeps spinning without her at the center." Jennifer added, with that voice that was sweet and poisonous at the same time. "It's the natural order of life. Everyone needs to accept their time." I looked around the table, hoping someone would defend me, would say how absurd that was. My Uncle Robert opened his mouth as if he were going to say something, but then just shook his head and went back to looking at his plate. My cousin Anna was speechless, but also didn't say anything. Carol tried to quickly change the subject, but the damage was already done. The total humiliation I felt in that moment is impossible to describe in words. It was as if I were naked in front of everyone, exposed and ridiculed. My own son had just declared me disposable in front of the entire family. And the worst part? No one had come to my defense. Some seemed embarrassed, others looked away, but no one confronted Michael. No one said, "Hey, you can't talk to your mother like that." Did they all agree with him? Did they all also think I'd lived long enough, that I needed to step out of the center? The shame gave way to a feeling of abandonment so deep I could barely breathe. I tried to reach for my water glass, but my hand was shaking so much I gave up. Jennifer, noticing my discomfort, or rather delighting in it, decided to twist the knife in the wound. "Don't take it personally, mother-in-law. It's just that you need to understand that Michael and I have our plans now, and these plans need independence." The word independence sounded like an insult, as if I were a burden preventing them from being free. Carol tried again to save the situation, offering dessert, bringing up another topic. But the mood was ruined. I could feel the weight of pitying looks on me, and that was almost as painful as my ungrateful son's words. Pity. Everyone there felt sorry for me. The pathetic elderly mother who didn't know when to exit the stage. I finished lunch on autopilot, not knowing what the food tasted like. Each forkful was a mechanical effort to seem normal, not to fall apart there in front of everyone. Michael and Jennifer kept talking normally, as if they hadn't just publicly humiliated me. They talked about a trip they were planning to take, about renovations to the apartment, about 1,000 mundane things. And me there, sitting at the same table, invisible, forgotten, discarded. It was in that moment that something inside me changed definitively. The pain began to give way to a cold clarity, a cruel lucidity. I finally understood that this wasn't a bad phase. It wasn't stress or Jennifer's passing influence. This was who my son had become. And I needed to accept that terrible truth. When lunch ended, I quickly said goodbye to everyone and practically ran to my car. I needed to get out of there before I completely fell apart. Carol came after me, tried to console me. "Don't pay attention to what he said. Michael's been stressed. It must be Jennifer filling his head." But I didn't want consolation. I didn't want justification. I wanted to disappear, hide, die of shame far from everyone. I drove home with tears streaming down my face, not even caring if other drivers were seeing. That emotional story I imagined having with my son had turned into a public nightmare. And the worst part was knowing that everyone had now witnessed my total humiliation, had seen with their own eyes the contempt my own son felt for me. When I got home, I locked myself in the bedroom and finally let everything out. I cried like I hadn't cried since childhood, that deep cry that comes from the depths of your soul. I cried for the mother who gave everything and received nothing. I cried for the woman who gave up herself thinking she'd be valued someday. I cried for the ungrateful daughter who was judged and publicly discarded. No, wait. I was the mother of the ungrateful son. But in that moment, it hurt so much it seemed like I was all of that together. The pain was physical, real, palpable. My chest burned, my head throbbed, my whole body screamed the injustice of it all. And the family's silence echoed louder than any scream. No one had defended me. Absolutely no one. I was completely alone. That night was one of the longest of my life. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, reliving every second of that cursed lunch. Michael's words echoed in my head nonstop. Jennifer's smile burned in my memory like hot iron. And the family's silence, that cowardly and complicit silence, hurt more than anything. It was as if everyone had agreed that, yes, I really had lived long enough, that it really was time to accept my secondary place in life. But you know what was worse? Realizing that I'd let it get to this point, that I'd been so submissive, so available, so useful, that everyone thought they could treat me that way. I became a doormat. And you step on doormats, you don't respect them. It was at that moment that something broke, definitively inside me. It wasn't just pain anymore. It was decision. And that decision was starting to take shape, slowly but irreversibly. The days that followed that lunch were strange. I didn't cry anymore. It was as if there were no more tears left. Something had changed inside me. a kind of emotional detachment I'd never experienced before. I'd wake up, have coffee, look at the empty house, and realize that for the first time in decades, I had no obligation to anyone besides myself. And you know what's curious? Instead of feeling lost, I started feeling a scary clarity, as if a fog that had been covering my vision for years had finally lifted. I looked in the mirror that Monday morning and saw a tired, hurt woman, but still standing. And it was in that moment I thought, if they think I've lived long enough, then I'm going to decide how to live what's left. This time, my way. I started with the obvious, the papers. I spent the whole morning looking for documents that had been stored in drawers for years. Deeds, bank statements, insurance policies, the old will I'd made when Michael was a teenager. I put everything on the living room table and stood there looking at that pile of paper for a good while. Each document there represented a decision I'd made, always thinking of him. The life insurance? Michael was the beneficiary. The small savings I'd managed to put together? Saved for his emergencies. Even the house, which I'd paid off with so much sacrifice, was in the will for him. I picked up that yellowed paper and read each line. I leave all my assets to my son Michael. I tore it up. Right there, without thinking twice, I tore that will into tiny pieces. The feeling was liberating and terrifying at the same time. Was I being too radical? Was I letting bitterness speak louder than a mother's love? Those questions hammered in my head, but every time I started to doubt, his voice came back, "You've lived long enough," and along with it came the image of Jennifer with that knowing smile, and the silence of the entire family leaving me alone in that humiliation. No, I wasn't being radical. I was, for the first time in my life, being realistic. My son had made it clear to me that I was disposable, and if I was disposable to him, then he also no longer had automatic rights over what was mine. Does it seem harsh when I say it like that? But his harshness had been much greater. I spent the following days organizing every aspect of my financial life. I went to the bank and changed the life insurance beneficiary. Now it was a charity institution that took care of underprivileged children. At least they would appreciate it, right? I transferred my small savings to an account that only I had access to, one Michael didn't even know existed. I canceled that additional card I'd given him to use in emergencies. Emergencies that always involved expensive dinners with Jennifer or installment payments for things they wanted but couldn't afford. Each change I made, I felt a mix of guilt and relief. The guilt came from years of conditioning as a sacrificing mother. The relief came from finally taking the reins of my own life. The hardest part was dealing with the small, everyday things. You know those habits we create without noticing? Well, every Friday, I'd make that chocolate cake Michael loved and take it to him. When Friday came, I grabbed the ingredients from the cupboard out of pure reflex. I was holding the flour when I stopped and thought, what for? To take it to someone who told me I've lived long enough? I put everything back. I made a small cake just for me, ate it with coffee while watching a TV show. It seemed wrong, but at the same time there was something revolutionary about it. On Sundays, I always called him to see if everything was okay, if he needed anything. That Sunday, my finger hovered over his name in my phone's contact list for long minutes. But I didn't call. And you know what happened? He didn't call either. 3 weeks went by without any contact, and that told me everything I needed to know. During this time of silence between us, I started noticing things that had gone unnoticed before. How the house was full of photos of him, but almost none of me. How I'd kept all his achievements, diploma, school soccer trophy, even his English course certificate, but had nothing that was just mine. Where were my accomplishments? Where was my identity outside of being Michael's mother? I started taking the photos off the walls one by one, not with anger, but with a calm determination. I put everything in a box and placed it in the closet. I grabbed old photos of myself, from when I was young, pretty, full of dreams, and put them in their place. The woman in those photos seemed like a stranger, but also seemed like someone I'd like to meet again. I updated my will with a new lawyer, one who didn't know my story with Michael. He didn't even blink when I said I wanted to leave the house to a distant cousin who'd always been affectionate with me, and the rest divided among charitable institutions. It's your decision, was all he said, and it really was. For the first time in decades, I was making decisions that were purely mine without thinking if they'd hurt someone or if they'd seem selfish. I reorganized my electricity, water, internet accounts, everything that previously had his name as an emergency contact. I erased it. I put Carol's name. Each small change was a declaration of independence. It was as if I were erasing Michael from my administrative life before erasing him from my emotional life. Or maybe it was the other way around. I don't know. I just know I needed to do it. There was a particularly difficult moment when I found a little box at the back of the closet. Inside were all the cards he used to write to me when he was little. To the best mom in the world. I love you, Mom. You're my hero. I read each one with my heart tight. Where did that affectionate little boy transform into the cold man who said I'd lived long enough? At what moment did love turn into convenience? I cried holding those little cards, but this time it wasn't a cry of despair. It was a cry of mourning. I was mourning for the relationship I thought I had, for the son who no longer existed. I put the cards back in the box, but didn't throw them away. I couldn't. Maybe there was still a thread of hope I didn't want to cut completely. Or maybe it was just weakness. I also started making practical plans for the future. I researched volunteer work, social groups, courses I'd always wanted to take. I wrote everything down in a new notebook, a notebook that was just mine, with nothing related to Michael. I looked at the list of old dreams, learn to play guitar, take painting classes, travel to the beach alone, maybe even do that education degree I always wanted. It seemed silly to think about these things at this stage in life, but also, why not? If I really had lived long enough, as he said, then let me live this too much the way I wanted, without explaining myself, without asking permission, without waiting for approval from an ungrateful son who saw me as a burden. The idea scared and excited me in equal measure. What's interesting is that during this whole reorganization process, I didn't feel anger. I expected to feel it, but I didn't. It was more a mixture of deep sadness and growing determination. Sadness for what could have been and wasn't. Determination not to let this bitterness consume me for the years I still had ahead. Each document I organized, each change I made, was like building an invisible wall between the painful past and the uncertain, but potentially mine future. And Michael? He had no idea what was happening. He continued his life normally, probably relieved that I'd finally given space like Jennifer wanted so much. But this calm wasn't going to last forever. Soon, very soon, he'd start to notice that something had changed. And when he noticed, it would be too late. The last thing I did in that phase was write a letter. Not to send, just to organize my thoughts. I wrote everything I felt, everything I'd swallowed for years, everything I wanted to have the courage to say to his face. You told me I've lived long enough. Maybe you're right, but if I've lived long enough, it was living for you, forgetting about myself. Now, I'm going to live what's left for my own good. You made your choice when you said those words. Now, I'm making mine. I reread the letter several times, left it stored in a drawer. I didn't know if I'd ever have the courage to show it, but writing it had been enough to consolidate my decision. I looked around the reorganized living room, at all the updated documents, at my life finally taking a direction that was mine. And for the first time in a long while, I took a deep breath without feeling that weight in my chest. The emotional story I imagined having with my son had ended. But maybe, just maybe, my own story was just beginning. And Michael? Well, he was about to discover what it really meant to lose someone. It took exactly 5 weeks. 5 weeks of total silence between us until the phone rang with his name on the screen. I was in the kitchen making tea when I saw the call. My first instinct was to answer right away, like I always did. But I hesitated. I looked at that name flashing and took a deep breath. It wasn't automatic anymore. It wasn't urgent anymore. I let it ring 3 times before answering. And when I said hello, my voice was surprisingly calm. On the other side, his voice sounded irritated from the start. Mom, where were you? I called yesterday too, and you didn't answer. He didn't call yesterday, I thought, but I let it go. I was busy, I replied simply. The silence that followed told me he wasn't expecting that response. Michael was used to the mother who dropped everything to answer him immediately. Okay, he continued, with that kind of impatient tone I knew so well. Look, I need you to help me with something. The air conditioner here at home broke down and the technician is charging a fortune to fix it. Can you transfer about $1,500 to me? It's this unbearable heat and Jennifer can't sleep properly. $1,500, thrown out there like that, as if it were pocket change, as if it were obvious I had it and should send it without questioning. In the old days, I'd already be opening the bank app while talking to him, apologizing for not having asked before if they needed anything. But this time was different. "I can't," I said. Simple as that. 2 words I'd never said to him before, at least not this way. The silence on the other side was so deep, I thought the call had dropped. "What do you mean you can't?" His voice went up a tone. "It's just a transfer, Mom. I know you have that money saved." Ah, so he knew about my savings. Of course he did. Jennifer had probably done the calculations just right. "It's not that I have it or don't have it, Michael. It's that I won't be able to help this time." I chose my words carefully, trying to stay calm. He huffed on the other side. "I can't believe this. When I need you, you can't. But when you want to show up in my life, you're always available, right?" The irony of that hit me like a punch. When I want to show up in his life. Me, who was sent away. Me, who was declared as someone who'd lived long enough. But I swallowed the comment. It wasn't time to argue. It was time to hold my position. "Michael, you're an adult man with a job and a wife. You guys will figure out how to solve this." My voice was firm, and that surprised me as much as it probably surprised him. "This is unbelievable." He was getting really nervous now. "You're doing this because you got upset about that conversation from weeks ago? Because I was honest? You're throwing a tantrum, is that it?" Tantrum. He'd reduced my pain, my total humiliation, to a childish tantrum. I gripped the phone tighter. "It's not a tantrum, Michael. It's priority. Now my priorities have changed." I heard him say something muffled, probably to Jennifer, and then she took the phone. Great. That was all I needed. "Mrs. Margaret?" Jennifer's sweet voice filled my ear. "I think you're not understanding the situation. Michael works very hard, supports our home, and $1,500 is nothing for you. It's just a favor between family. Between family, as if family were a credit card you use when you need it." "Jennifer, dear," I began, and put as much fake sweetness in my voice as she always did. "I understand the situation perfectly. You guys are adults. You have your responsibilities, and one of them is solving your own problems." Silence. Then she tried another approach. "You know Michael has done his best to be a good son, right? Even with all the stress you caused showing up without warning, interfering." I hung up. For the first time in my life, I hung up the phone in her face. And you know what I felt? Freedom. The phone rang again immediately. I ignored it. It rang 3 more times in a row. I kept ignoring it while I finished my tea. When it finally stopped, the messages came. Michael sent about 5 in a row, each one more agitated than the last. "I can't believe you hung up on Jennifer. That's disrespectful. We always helped you when you needed it. You're being selfish." I read each message with surprising calmness. The last one was the most revealing. "You've always been difficult. Jennifer was right. So that was it. The gold digger daughter-in-law had been right about me. I was the difficult one. I was the problem." I took a deep breath and typed a single response. "You guys will manage to figure it out. Good luck." And I put the phone on, silent. The following days brought more calls and messages, all ignored. Michael tried to argue that they needed family support, that I was abandoning him. Each word was calculated to make me feel guilty. And it worked a little, I won't lie. There were moments when I almost gave in, almost transferred the money just to end that pressure. But then I'd remember his phrase, that horrible lunch, Jennifer's smile, and the guilt gave way to determination. They'd taught me I was disposable. Now they were learning what that really meant. It wasn't just me leaving their lives. It was them losing all the benefits my presence brought. And apparently, that was hurting more than they imagined. A week after the air conditioner call, another one came. Their car had broken down. They needed $2,000 for the parts. "It's a real emergency, Mom. I'm not making this up." Michael's voice had an almost desperate tone now. Part of me wanted to give in. But the stronger part remembered that emergencies happen to everyone, and everyone figures it out. "Ask for a bank loan," I suggested. "You guys have credit, stable jobs?" He was silent for a moment. "It's different. Loans have interest. You're my mother." Exactly. I was his mother. The elderly mother who'd lived long enough, remember? The mother who supposedly was interfering with their bright future. "Michael, you guys chose your independence. That comes with responsibilities." And I hung up again. The messages that came after were revealing. Jennifer sent a long text talking about a mother's obligations, about how I was bitter and was getting revenge over nothing. At the end, she wrote, "Michael always said you were controlling. Now I understand. Controlling for not giving money? Interesting. When I gave, it was interference. When I didn't give, it was control. There was no way to win with these people." But you know what caught my attention the most? The gradual change in the tone of the messages. At first it was anger, then it turned into irritation. Now, something different was starting to appear. Concern. They were starting to realize that the well had really dried up, that the elderly and available mother wasn't there anymore to solve all their problems. 2 weeks went by like this, with increasingly frequent requests, and each one denied. One time it was a late bill, another was a credit card payment, another was just $300 to help with the month's groceries. Each no I gave became easier than the previous one. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was almost liberating. I was learning to say no to my own son, and the world wasn't ending. I wasn't dying of remorse. Actually, I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a long time: self-respect. Each ignored call was a declaration that I had value beyond my usefulness. Each unanswered message was a reminder that love can't be bought, and I'd been buying his for too long. Now he was having to deal with the consequences of his own ingratitude, and apparently it wasn't being easy. What I didn't know yet was that those small problems were just the beginning. The real shock was still to come for them. Because when you build a lifestyle based on someone's constant support and that someone disappears, the whole structure starts to crack. And the cracks were beginning to appear in the perfect life Michael and Jennifer had built. The beautiful apartment, the designer clothes, the expensive dinners, all of that depended on a financial margin they didn't have alone. And that margin was me. Now that I'd left the equation, their math simply didn't add up anymore. And the more time passed, the clearer this became, especially to Jennifer, who was starting to look at her husband with different eyes much less loving than before. 3 months had passed since I cut the financial cord, and the news reaching me, through my sister Carol, who still talked to Michael, painted an increasingly complicated picture. Apparently, they'd had to sell the imported car they showed off so much. They traded it for a used one, much simpler. The weekend trips to expensive resorts had stopped completely. And worst of all, according to Carol, with that tone of someone who doesn't want to seem like a gossip but is dying to tell, Jennifer was complaining more and more loudly. She told Michael she expected more from him, that the marriage had been sold as one thing and was being another. Carol whispered on the phone. I swallowed the bitter smile that wanted to appear. So the gold-digger daughter-in-law was showing her true face? What a surprise. It was on a Saturday afternoon that my phone rang with his number again. This time, I answered on the first ring. I can't explain why. Maybe curiosity, maybe that silly thread of hope that still stubbornly existed. Mom? His voice sounded tired, different. We need to talk. I stayed silent, waiting. He took a deep breath on the other side. Things are complicated here. Very complicated. The company is cutting benefits. We had to make some adjustments. Adjustments. Nice word to say they were going through hardship. And I know maybe I was harsh with you in that conversation. Maybe I exaggerated. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't an apology. It was a minimal admission of error, made probably under pressure from the financial situation. I knew my son too well not to notice the difference. Michael, you told me I'd lived long enough. In front of the entire family, you made me go through the total humiliation of being treated as disposable. That's not being harsh. That's being cruel. My voice came out firmer than I expected. He was silent for a few seconds. I know. But you know how it is. Jennifer gets in my ear, the stress from work. I didn't mean it exactly that way. Ah, so now it was Jennifer's fault? The stress? Everything except himself? Michael, you said it, and repeated it in front of everyone. Those words came out of your mouth, not hers. I heard him sigh impatiently. Okay, but we can't be stuck in the past forever. What I wanted to say is that maybe we could help each other again. Like it always was. Like it always was. The phrase hit me like a slap. Like it always was meant me giving and him receiving. Like it always was meant me erasing myself and him benefiting. Like it always was meant me being useful and him being grateful only when he needed something. I felt the anger rise in my throat like bile. Help each other? I repeated. Michael, when exactly did you help me? Give me one example. Silence. A long, embarrassing silence. I always valued you, he tried, but his voice was weak. Always respected you as a mother. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It was a bitter laugh, full of years of accumulated disappointment. Respect isn't what you showed when you said I'd lived long enough, son. Respect isn't what Jennifer shows every time she treats me like an employee. I heard a muffled argument on the other side. Jennifer had noticed the conversation wasn't going as they'd planned. You're being difficult on purpose, Michael's voice came back, now with that petulant tone I knew from his teenage years. We're just asking for temporary support until things get better. Is that too much to ask? Temporary support. How many times had I heard that over the years? And the temporary always became permanent, always became expected, always became obligation. Yes, Michael. This time it is too much to ask, I said with a calmness that surprised me. You guys are adults, have jobs, have responsibilities. It's time to take them on alone. He huffed, frustrated. You've changed. I don't know what happened to you, but you're not the same person anymore. He was right. I had changed. The elderly and available mother who did everything for her ungrateful son without questioning had died that afternoon when he said I'd lived long enough. In her place, a woman was being born who was finally learning to value herself. You're right, Michael. I have changed. And you know what else? This change was the best thing that's happened to me in years. I heard him curse under his breath. Jennifer said something in the background I couldn't understand, but the tone was clearly irritated. Okay then, if that's how you want it, each one in their own corner. The implicit threat was clear. If I didn't help, he'd distance himself for good. As if that would be a loss to me now. If that's what you think is best, I replied simply. And this time it was me who hung up first. I sat on the couch for a long time after that call. I expected to feel guilt, that familiar weight in my chest, but what I felt was a mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because the emotional story I'd dreamed of with my son would never be real. Relief because I'd finally set clear boundaries. He'd tried to come back, but not with love, with need. Not with genuine regret, with convenience. And I'd been strong enough to see the difference. That had to count for something, right? I looked at my old photo on the wall, the one I'd put in place of his photos. The girl in the photo had dreams and hopes. Maybe it was time to finally honor that girl. The following weeks were of absolute silence between us, but the news kept coming through Carol, who seemed to have become the official reporter of Michael's life soap opera. He's been strange at family gatherings, you know, kind of quiet, kind of down, Carol would tell with that tone of someone wanting to awaken my pity. And Jennifer? Oh, Margaret, that woman is poison. She's always comparing him to other husbands, saying that so-and-so earns more, that what's his name has a better house. I listened to everything in silence. Part of me, that part that was still a mother despite everything, felt a tightness. But the bigger part, the part that had survived the humiliation and pain, understood that this was the consequence of his own choices. He'd chosen a gold-digger woman. He'd chosen to push me away. Now, he was reaping the fruits. You're not going to do anything? Carol asked, expecting me to run to save my son like I always did. No, I replied firmly. I'm not going to do anything, Carol. He's an adult. His choices have consequences. She stayed silent, probably hoping I'd change my mind. But he's your son, she tried one more time. Yes, and precisely because of that, it hurt so much when he told me I'd lived long enough. If he's my son and was capable of treating me that way, then he needs to learn to deal with the consequences of his own actions. Carol sighed. You really are different. Yes, I was. And for the first time, that didn't seem like a bad thing. It was different, but it was healthier, more true, more dignified. What I didn't know yet was that their situation was much worse than Carol was telling. Michael had hidden from the family how deeply in debt they really were. The credit cards were maxed out, bills falling behind, their standard of living collapsing like a house of cards. And Jennifer? Well, she wasn't exactly the type of woman who stands by her husband when things get tough. She was the type who jumps off the boat before it completely sinks. And the boat of their marriage was starting to take on water in a way that not even Michael's pride could hide much longer. The fall was just beginning, and the higher you are, the more painful the landing when you finally hit the ground. The last thing I knew before everything collapsed was through a distant cousin who worked in the same building as Michael. I saw him arguing with his wife in the parking lot the other day. It was ugly, Margaret. She was yelling that he was a failure, that he'd promised a lifestyle he couldn't maintain. I swallowed hard. As upset as I was with my ungrateful son, hearing that he was being humiliated like that squeezed my heart. But I also knew I couldn't save someone who didn't recognize they needed saving. Michael still hadn't gotten there. He still thought the problem was me becoming selfish, not him being cruel. Until he saw the truth, any help from me would just be a band-aid on a wound that needed surgery. And that surgery, as painful as it was, he'd have to face alone. 6 months after that cold phone conversation, Michael showed up at my door without warning. It was a Sunday morning, and I was having coffee on the porch, enjoying the nice sun, when I heard the doorbell ring. My heart jumped. This type of surprise visit is never good news. I opened the door, and there he was, with an appearance that shocked me. He'd lost weight. The dark circles were deep, his clothes wrinkled. He was no longer that impeccable man he used to be. "Mom, can I come in?" His voice was tired, broken. I nodded and stepped away from the door. He entered slowly, looking around as if the house were strange, as if years had passed since the last time he was there. And maybe, emotionally, they had. We sat in the living room in silence for a few minutes. Me waiting for him to speak, him probably gathering courage. "Things aren't good," he finally began, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Jennifer and I, everything's falling apart. Financially, emotionally, everything." I remained silent, just watching. Part of me wanted to jump and offer help immediately, that mother instinct that never dies completely. But the stronger part, the one that had survived everything, held me firm in the chair. "And I know that I treated you badly. That conversation about you having lived long enough." He paused, his voice choked. "I shouldn't have said that. Shouldn't have. Not, it was horrible, or it was cruel. Just shouldn't have." The difference between real regret and convenient regret was right there, clear as water. "Michael," I began, choosing my words carefully, "you destroyed me with that phrase. It wasn't just what you said, it was how you said it, with coldness, with indifference, as if I were an old object that needs to be thrown away." He looked at me, and I saw tears beginning to form in the corners of his eyes. I know, I was wrong. Was, past tense, as if it were something that had already been resolved by the simple act of acknowledging it. "You humiliated me in front of the entire family," I continued, feeling my voice tremble a little but staying firm. "You let your wife silently agree while you turned me into a joke. You reduced me to a nuisance, a burden. And no one defended me, Michael. No one. Especially you, who should have been the first." He ran his hands over his face, a gesture of frustration I knew well. "I know all that. Why do you think I'm here? I'm trying to fix it." His voice went up a tone, a spark of that old irritation appearing, and it was in that moment I realized he wasn't there out of genuine regret. He was there because he needed me again. "Fix it how, Michael? By telling me you shouldn't have said that? That doesn't fix years of disrespect. It doesn't erase the total humiliation I felt." He got up, started pacing the room nervously. "So what do you want? For me to kneel? To beg? I admitted I was wrong. What more do you want from me?" And there was the truth. He thought a minimal admission of error was enough for everything to go back to the way it was before. "I want you to understand the pain you caused," I replied, also standing up. "I want you to see that you spent years using me, treating me as a personal bank, as an employee, as anything but your mother. I want you to understand that love isn't convenience, and that you turned our relationship into a business transaction where I always came out losing." He stopped walking and stared at me. "That's not true. I always loved you." The word love sounded empty, coming from him. "Then tell me, Michael, when was the last time you called me just to see how I was, without needing anything? When was the last time you defended me from Jennifer when she treated me badly? When was the last time you valued me without having an interest behind it?" He opened his mouth to answer, but nothing came out. The answer was obvious. Never. "I didn't come here to be attacked," he said finally, his voice defensive. "I came because I thought we could talk like adults. Solve this. Solve. As if it were a technical problem, a simple misunderstanding. Michael, you didn't come here to solve anything. You came because you're in need, whether for money, support, whatever. But it's not about me being hurt or you really being sorry. It's about usefulness, like it always was." I saw hurt appear on his face, as if my words were unfair. "You're being cruel now, Just like Jennifer says, you hold grudges about everything. So now I was the cruel one? I was the one holding grudges? I took a deep breath, counting to 10 mentally. If I hold grudges, son, it's because you planted many reasons for it over the years. And Jennifer? She has no moral authority to talk about me. Ah, so it's about Jennifer? He crossed his arms, assuming a defensive posture. You never liked her, never gave her a chance. I almost laughed at the irony. Michael, Jennifer made it very clear from day one that I was inconvenient, that I interfered with her plans with you, and you let it happen. You let her treat me badly, let her poison our relationship, let her turn you into someone I don't recognize anymore. He shook his head. She didn't do any of that. She just wants what's best for us, for our marriage. If you can't see that, the problem is yours. And there it was. His loyalty was with her, not with me. Even after everything, even with the marriage falling apart, he still defended the gold-digger daughter-in-law who was only with him out of interest. And that realization hurt more than I expected. You know what's funny? I sat down again, suddenly very tired. Jennifer was always whispering in your ear saying I controlled you, that I didn't let you be free. And what did she do? She controlled you in a way I never did. She turned you into someone bitter, calculating, self-interested. She made you measure people's value by what they can offer, not by who they are. Michael stood still, processing. For a second, I saw a shadow of doubt pass over his face. But then he composed himself. You're saying that because you want to blame someone. But the truth is, you never knew how to deal with the fact that I grew up, had my own life. Grow up. Was that what he called becoming ungrateful, selfish, cruel? No, Michael. I always knew you'd grow up and have your life. What I didn't know is that growing up for you meant completely discarding me. The silence that settled between us was heavy, loaded with years of unspoken hurts, poorly reciprocated love, frustrated expectations. I looked at my son and saw a stranger. When did we lose each other? Or did we never really have each other? Look, he tried again, his voice softer now. I understand you're hurt, but life goes on, Mom. We need to move forward, and for that, we need to support each other. There it was again, the request for support disguised as reconciliation. Michael, I'm going to move forward. I'm already moving forward, actually, but not in the way you imagine. Not going back to being your financial and emotional safety net while I receive crumbs of affection in return. He sighed, frustrated. So you're not going to help me, is that it? Finally getting to the point. Not in the way you want. Not financially, not going back to being that mother who overlooked everything. He grabbed his keys from his pocket, the gesture of someone leaving. I tried, Mom. I came all the way here, opened my heart, admitted my mistakes. If that's not enough for you, then I don't know what else to do. I got up and walked to him. For a moment, I wanted to hug him, to say everything was fine, that I'd always be there. But everything wasn't fine, and I wouldn't always be there, not in the way it was before. Michael, what you did today wasn't opening your heart. It was trying to renegotiate the terms of our relationship because life got difficult. When you really regret it, when you really understand the pain you caused without expecting anything in return, maybe we can rebuild something. But meanwhile, I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. Meanwhile, you need to learn to stand on your own, like a real adult. He looked at me with a mixture of anger and desperation, nodded and left without more words. I closed the door and leaned against it, my body trembling. It had been one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Not yelling, not crying, not giving in. It had demanded a strength I didn't even know I had. I walked to the window and saw his car pulling away, probably heading back to Jennifer, who'd be waiting anxiously to find out if the mission to get money from her mother-in-law had been successful. The emotional story I'd dreamed of having with my son was definitely dead now, but for the first time, I didn't feel destroyed by it. I felt at peace, a painful peace, but peace nonetheless. Michael still hadn't understood anything. He still thought I was the problem, that I was being stubborn, bitter. But maybe, just maybe, when everything finally fell apart, and it was gonna fall apart, I could feel it. He'd finally wake up to reality. And when he woke up, it'd be too late for some things. But who knows? Maybe it wouldn't be too late for others. 2 months after that tense conversation, I got a call from Carol in the middle of the night. My heart raced. Calls at dawn are never good news. Margaret, you need to know. Jennifer left Michael. Her voice was loaded with urgency and barely disguised gossip. I sat up in bed, turning on the lamp. "What do you mean she left?" Carol sighed. "She's gone, Margaret. Packed her things and walked out. Seems she met another guy, a successful lawyer who frequents the same places she does. Michael's destroyed." I stayed silent, processing. Part of me knew this was going to happen. The gold digger daughter-in-law was never going to stick around when things got really tough. But hearing it had actually happened was different. "And how is he?" I asked, surprised by my own concern. "Terrible. Completely devastated." The following days brought more news through the family gossip network. Michael had fallen into deep depression, wasn't going to work properly. The company was threatening to fire him. The apartment? He couldn't afford it alone anymore and was about to be evicted. The expensive furniture, the designer clothes, everything being sold little by little to try to cover the debts that Jennifer had helped pile up. It was like watching a house of cards collapse in slow motion. Part of me, that stubborn part that was still a mother, wanted to run and save him. But the more sensible part, the one that had learned to value herself, knew he needed to hit rock bottom to finally wake up. And rock bottom was coming fast for him, really fast. 3 weeks after the separation, Michael showed up at my door again, but this time was different. He wasn't just down, he was broken, completely destroyed. His clothes were dirty, his beard unshaven, his eyes red and swollen from crying so much. When I opened the door, he just collapsed, fell to his knees right there in the entrance, and started sobbing. "Mom, I ruined everything, everything." I stood there, looking at this scene I'd never imagined witnessing. My proud son, always so sure of his choices, was there on the floor, broken into 1,000 pieces. "Come in," I said softly, helping him stand up. He could barely walk, leaning on me like he was going to collapse at any moment. I led him to the couch, where he curled up like a scared child. "She left," he began, his voice broken by sobs. "She just left. Said she wasn't going to stay with a failure, that she deserved better. Took half the stuff, left half the debts, and left like I was nothing." The words came out in a desperate torrent. "And the worst part, Mom, the worst part is you were right. About everything. About her being a gold digger, about me turning into someone horrible, about everything." I sat next to him, keeping a safe distance. I wanted to comfort him, but I also needed him to really understand what he'd done. "Michael, you didn't turn into someone horrible suddenly. It was a process, and in every step of that process, you made choices." He shook his head, tears flowing freely now. "I treated you so badly," he continued, finally looking at me. And in that look, I saw something I'd never seen before. Genuine regret. It wasn't the convenient regret from last time. It was real pain, real recognition. "I said you'd already lived too much. How could I say that? You who gave everything for me, sacrificed yourself for years, and I discarded you like you were worth nothing." His voice broke completely. "And I did it in front of everyone, humiliated you, treated you like garbage. And why? Because of a woman who was worthless, who only wanted my money. Money that wasn't even mine. It was always yours." It was hard hearing that without feeling my heart tighten. "And now she's gone," I continued for him. "And you've got nothing." He nodded miserably. "I lost the apartment, Mom. I'm getting evicted next week. The car went to auction for debt. The company's about to fire me because I can't focus on anything. I lost everything." He paused, wiping tears with trembling hands. "And the worst part is, I deserve it. I deserve every piece of this misery because I was an ungrateful son. Because I treated you the way I treated you. Because I believed Jennifer when she said you were the problem, when the problem was always us." The silence that followed was heavy. He was there, completely vulnerable, admitting everything. And for the first time, it seemed genuine. He wasn't trying to manipulate, wasn't expecting something in return. He was just acknowledging the cruel truth of what he'd done. "I didn't come here to ask for money," he said, reading my thoughts. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I burned that bridge. I came because I needed you to know I finally get it. I understand that you weren't being difficult or bitter. You were protecting yourself from me, from the monster I'd become." He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture of desperation. "And I know it's too late. I know I ruined our relationship forever, but I needed to ask your forgiveness. A forgiveness I know I don't deserve." The tears came back with full force. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry for every cruel word, for every disrespect, for letting Jennifer treat you badly, for using you, for humiliating you. I'm sorry for saying you'd already lived too much when you should live forever for my sake. I felt my own tears starting to fall. Was this what I needed to hear? Maybe, but it also hurt. It hurt seeing my son so broken, even knowing he'd dug his own hole. Michael, I began, choosing my words carefully. I know you're sorry now, and I believe it's genuine. But you understand it's not just about apologizing, right? It's about rebuilding, and rebuilding takes time. A lot of time. He nodded vigorously. I know. I'm not expecting you to forgive me now, or for things to go back to normal. I know that might never happen. I just needed you to know I finally woke up. Too late, but I woke up. And in that moment, I believed him. For the first time in years, I believed he was really seeing the truth. Do you have somewhere to stay? I asked, my mother's voice finally emerging. He shook his head no. Thought about asking my friend Dave to let me sleep on his couch for a few days. I sighed deeply. Here was the crossroads. I could let him leave, let him hit rock bottom completely alone. That's what the rational part of me said I should do. But there was another part, small but present, that was still a mother. You can stay in the guest room, I finally said, but with conditions. You're going to look for work every day. You're going to contribute what you can. And we're going to talk for real about everything that happened. No sweeping it under the rug. He looked at me with a mixture of shock and gratitude. Really? After everything? It's not about excusing everything, Michael. It's about not abandoning you when you're finally ready to truly change. He stood up unsteadily and, hesitantly, opened his arms, asking for a hug. I stood still for a second, all the pain and humiliation from the last months coming back like a wave. But then I saw my son. Not the arrogant and cruel man he'd become, but the broken man who was finally facing his own failures. I opened my arms and hugged him, feeling him completely collapse on my shoulders, crying like he hadn't cried since he was a child. I'm so sorry, Mom, so sorry. He repeated it like a mantra, and I just held him, letting him pour out years of pride and arrogance that had finally crumbled. It wasn't complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was a beginning. A painful and uncertain beginning, but a beginning nonetheless. That night, while Michael slept in the guest room, I sat alone in the living room thinking about everything. Jennifer had served as the final catalyst. She'd ripped the blindfold from his eyes in the cruelest way possible. She'd used him, sucked everything she could, and thrown him away when he was no longer useful. And in the process, she'd made him feel exactly what he'd made me feel. Disposable, useless, insufficient. It was poetic and brutal justice at the same time. The villain in my story had fallen, not because I'd done something against him, but because his own choices had led to this fall. And now he was there, in the next room, having to rebuild not just his life, but mainly his character. It'd be a long road. Maybe we'd never go back to what we were, if we ever really were anything besides an illusion. But for the first time in a long time, there was a possibility. Small, fragile, but real. And that had to mean something. The first days with Michael living at home were strange, to say the least. He walked around the house like a ghost, quiet, trying to take up as little space as possible. In the morning, he'd wake up early and was already looking for jobs on the old computer I'd stored away. He didn't ask for anything, didn't complain about anything. It was like he was walking on eggshells, afraid I'd change my mind and kick him out. And you know what was most curious? For the first time in years, I wasn't taking care of him. Wasn't running around, preparing special food, asking if he needed something. I was just living my life. And gradually, I realized that was the fundamental difference. Before, I lived for him. Now I lived for myself. And he was just there, having to learn to do the same. It was around that time I started putting into practice those plans I'd written down months ago. Remember the notebook with old dreams? Well, I took it out of the drawer, flipped through the pages, and decided it was time. First step, guitar lessons. I found a music school near home that offered classes for adults. When I got there the first time, I was nervous. There was a beginner's class, most of them way younger than me. The teacher, Sarah, greeted me with a huge smile. "It's never too late to start," she said, and that sounded like the validation I didn't even know I needed. In the first class, my fingers could barely press the strings right. It hurt, was awkward, frustrating, but it was also freeing. There I wasn't a mother, wasn't an ex-wife, wasn't anything but Margaret learning something new just because I wanted to. Michael noticed when I started going out more. At first, he'd get kinda lost when I announced I was going to guitar class or the painting group I'd also started attending. Once he asked, with genuine curiosity, "Since when do you paint?" And I answered with a smile, "Since yesterday. Found out I like it." He stared at me with a strange expression, like he was seeing a stranger, and maybe he was. The elderly mother he knew was transforming into a woman with her own hobbies, her own interests, her own life. And the most interesting part? I wasn't asking permission for any of it, wasn't explaining too much, wasn't justifying myself. I just did it. And that freedom was intoxicating in a way I'd never experienced before. 3 months after he'd moved into the house, I did something I'd never done in my life. I booked a solo trip, a week at the beach, in a simple but charming hotel I'd seen advertised. When I told Michael, his eyes widened. "Alone? You're gonna travel alone?" There was genuine concern in his voice, but also surprise. "Yeah, I am," I responded naturally. "Always wanted to see that region, never had the opportunity. Now I do." He wanted to say something, probably about it being dangerous or not making sense to travel alone, but he held back. He was learning not to give opinions about my choices, and that, surprisingly, was making him grow as much as it was freeing me. Seeing his mother living without asking permission was a lesson he needed to learn, a lesson that came late, but it came. The trip was transformative. I spent 7 days walking on the beach, reading books I'd always wanted to read, talking with interesting people at the hotel, eating what I wanted when I wanted. There was nobody to answer to, nobody to take care of, nobody to worry about besides myself. On the 3rd day, sitting on the sand watching the sunset, I started crying. But it wasn't tears of sadness. It was relief. Relief for being alive, for having managed to get there, for having survived everything and still being capable of feeling joy. The emotional story of my life hadn't been what I'd imagined with my son, but it was revealing itself as a different story, one where I was the protagonist, not the supporting character, and that was worth more than any recognition I'd expected from him. When I came back from the trip, Michael was different too. He'd gotten a job. It wasn't the glorious position he'd had before, it was simple work in an accounting office, but he was proud. "I got it on my own, Mom, without asking anyone to intervene. Without family name, without anything, just with my resume and my effort." I saw the gleam of dignity in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in a long time. "That's great, son, really," and it was sincere. Seeing him rebuilding his life from scratch, with humility, was more gratifying than any easy success he'd had before. That night, we had dinner together, and for the first time in years, the conversation was light. He asked me about the trip, really listened to my stories, laughed at my small tourist disasters. It was strange and wonderful at the same time, building a new relationship without the old vices. I also started getting involved with volunteer work. Every Tuesday and Thursday, I'd go to a community center that offered tutoring for underprivileged children. Remember the dream of studying education? Well, even without a degree, I could help those kids learn to read, do homework, dream of better futures. And they loved me. "Miss Margaret," they'd yell when I arrived, running to hug me. There I was, important, not for what I gave materially, but for my time, patience, genuine affection. One of those children, little Sophie at 7 years old, once told me, "You're like a grandma, but you're not annoying like mine." I laughed so hard at that innocent phrase. Yeah, I was kinda like a grandma who still had a lot to give, but now gave by choice, not obligation. Michael started going with me sometimes to the community center. At first, I was surprised by his request. "Can I go with you? I think it'd be good for me to do something like that too." And it was. Seeing him interact with those kids with patience I didn't know he had, helping with math, playing during breaks, that showed me there was still goodness in him. Maybe it had always been there, just got lost along the way. On the way back home, he said quietly, "I should have done this before. Should have learned earlier that life isn't just about making money and impressing people." I glanced at him while driving. "But you learned now, and that's already something." He smiled sadly. "Yeah. Late, but I learned." The guitar lessons were progressing, and I'd even started playing some simple songs. I invited some friends from the painting group over for tea at home, and I played for them. They applauded with genuine enthusiasm, and I felt fulfilled in a small, modest way, but profoundly true. Michael stayed in his room during the gathering, giving me space. But when the friends left, he came down and said, "You played really well, Mom, and you seem happy." I stopped what I was doing and looked at him. "You know, Michael, I think I am. Happy, I mean. Not in the way I imagined it'd be, not with the perfect family and proud son, but happy in my own way, with my own accomplishments." He nodded, eyes welling up. "You deserve it, always deserved it," and I was too blind to see. The months kept passing, and our relationship rebuilt itself slowly, brick by brick. It wasn't the same as before, and thank God for that. It was more honest, more balanced. He contributed to rent now that he was employed, insisted on it even though I said I didn't need it. I do need to, Mom, for myself. I need to know I'm not that ungrateful son anymore who only received without giving anything back. I accepted, not because I needed the money, but because I understood that was part of his rebuilding. We had deep conversations about the past, about Jennifer, about how he'd let materialism blind him. Some conversations were difficult, reopened wounds, but they were necessary. It was like cleaning a wound before it could truly heal. 9 months after he'd arrived broken at my door, we were having a normal dinner when he said something that caught me by surprise. "Mom, I wanted to thank you." I stopped eating and looked at him. "For taking me in when I didn't deserve it, for teaching me, even in a tough way, what really matters in life, for showing me it's never too late to start over." I felt a tightness in my chest, the good kind of tightness. "You know it'll still take time, right? For us to really fix everything?" He nodded. "I know, and that's okay. I'm willing to take however long is necessary, because this time I understand that relationships aren't transactions. They're daily construction, they're respect, they're real presence." I smiled, feeling tears threatening to fall. "You really grew up, Michael." And it was true. The man sitting in front of me wasn't the one who'd said I'd already lived too much anymore. He was someone new, forged by pain and humility. 1 year after that horrible afternoon when Michael said I'd already lived too much, I'm here sitting on the same porch, having breakfast, but everything's different, completely different. The sun hits my face the same way, but I'm not the same woman I was. I look at my hands, hands that held my son when he was a baby, that worked to the bone to give him everything, that trembled with pain when I was humiliated, that finally learned to hold the reins of my own life. These hands now play guitar, paint pictures, hold books I read for pleasure, hug children who aren't mine but who fill me with purpose. These hands now live for me. And that's not selfishness. It's survival. It's rebirth. Michael moved out 3 months ago. He managed to save enough money to rent a small, modest apartment on the other side of town. When he told me, I felt a mix of pride and a slight tightness in my heart. "Are you sure? You can stay here as long as you need," I offered. But he shook his head with a determined smile. "I need to do this, Mom. I need to prove to myself I can. And we need to have our space, our healthy independence." And he was right. Living together had been important for rebuilding, but the real test was him being able to stand on his own without depending on anyone. On moving day, I helped carry some boxes, few, because he didn't have much. And when we said goodbye, he hugged me tight. "Thanks for not giving up on me, even when I deserved for you to give up." Now he calls me twice a week, not to ask for anything, just to talk. He asks how my classes went, if I painted something new, how the kids at the community center are doing. And he tells me about his work, about challenges, about how he's learning to live with less and realizing that's way more than enough. Sometimes I still see shadows of the past. When he comments about some financial difficulty, I notice the old impulse wanting to solve it, but I hold back, and he doesn't ask either. He's really learning. In one of our last lunch meetings, he told me he started therapy. "The therapist made me see a lot of things, Mom. About how I projected my insecurity onto you, about how Jennifer manipulated that. It was hard to hear, but necessary. It was confirmation that he was really doing the internal work of change." Jennifer? Well, I heard through others that her relationship with that lawyer guy already ended. Apparently, she tried playing the same game, living off him, and the guy caught on quick. She's living with her mother now, according to rumors. I'm not going to lie and say I didn't feel a tiny bit of satisfaction hearing that. The gold-digger daughter-in-law who thought so highly of herself, who humiliated me so much, who destroyed my relationship with my son, was tasting her own medicine. But that satisfaction didn't last long, because I realized that dwelling on her downfall was giving her space in my head she didn't deserve anymore. She was a painful learning tool, both for me and for Michael. But now she was the past, and I was too busy living my present to worry about her past. I started enrolling in some online courses. Nothing too formal, but things I'd always wanted to learn. Art history, literature, even a photography course. My house became a small museum of my creative attempts. Slightly crooked paintings on the walls, black and white printed photos, a guitar leaning in the corner of the living room, always ready for when inspiration strikes. When friends come visit me, they're impressed. "Margaret, you're unrecognizable. So, alive." And that word, alive, gets me every time. Because that's exactly it. I'm still alive. Not in the sense Michael meant when he said I'd already lived too much, but truly alive, pulsing, experimenting, growing. At 67 years old, I'm more alive than I've been in decades. The community center became an important part of my routine. Besides the tutoring classes, I started coordinating a reading group for the older kids. We choose books together, discuss the stories, do related activities. Seeing those little eyes shining when they discover the pleasure of reading is priceless. One of the teenagers, Maya, told me the other day, "Miss Margaret, when I grow up, I want to be like you. Strong and happy." I couldn't hold back tears. Strong and happy. Two adjectives nobody would have used to describe me a year ago. But now they make sense. Because I am strong. I survived total humiliation, rejection from my own son, complete rebuilding of my life. And I am happy, in a quiet, deep, true way. There are still difficult days. I'm not going to romanticize it. There are days when I wake up and the wound still hurts. Days when I see a mother with her adult son laughing together at the supermarket and feel a pang of envy, of mourning for what I didn't have. There are nights when I reread those old little letters Michael used to write as a child and cry for the lost innocence, for the relationship that could have been. But those days are increasingly rare, and when they come, I allow myself to feel the pain, cry if I need to, but not drown in it. I learned that pain is part of life, but it doesn't need to be the entire life. I learned I can carry the sadness of what was and the joy of what is at the same time. Both things can coexist, and that makes me human, not weak. Michael recently asked me if I'd forgiven him. We stayed silent for a while after the question. "Forgiving isn't forgetting, Michael," I responded carefully. "It's not erasing what happened or pretending it didn't hurt. Forgiving is choosing not to let the pain control my life. It's recognizing you messed up badly, that you hurt me deeply, but also seeing you're genuinely changing. It's deciding our relationship is worth trying to rebuild, even if it's never the same as it was, or as I imagined it was." He nodded, eyes welling up. "I don't need it to be the same. I just need it to be true." And that phrase of his summed everything up. True. Our relationship now was true, with flaws and exposed wounds, but also with honesty and real effort. And that was worth more than any perfect fantasy I'd maintained for years. The emotional story I'd imagined having with my son really died. But in its place, something different is growing. More complex, more real, more painful, but also more honest. I don't know if I'll forgive him completely one day. Maybe yes, maybe no. And I discovered that's okay, not knowing. I don't need to have all the answers, don't need to force feelings that aren't ready yet. What's important is I'm living for myself, making my choices, building my happiness independent of his approval or anyone else's. And if he continues on the path he's on, if he really transforms into the man he's trying to be, maybe we'll build something beautiful together. But if we don't, I'll be fine, because I learned to be fine alone. This morning, before the sun fully rose, I went for a walk in the plaza near home. It's something I started doing recently, waking up early, watching the world wake up, breathing fresh air. While walking, I thought about everything I've been through in the last year. The pain, the humiliation, the anger, the rebuilding, the discovery of myself. It was a roller coaster I never asked to ride, but that took me to places inside me I didn't even know existed. I stopped at a bench, looked at the sky starting to brighten, and felt a deep peace. It wasn't the peace of someone who has everything figured out. It was the peace of someone who learned to live with imperfections, with wounds that haven't completely healed yet, with questions that don't have easy answers. It was the peace of someone who finally found herself. "You've already lived too much," he'd said. And you know what? He was completely wrong. I haven't lived too much. I almost didn't live at all. I spent decades existing for other people, canceling myself out, erasing myself. Now finally, I was starting to truly live. And living means making choices for myself, means saying no when I need to, means seeking my own happiness without guilt. Living means waking up in the morning and feeling the day is mine, not someone else's. Living means making mistakes, learning, growing, even at 67 years old. Living means looking in the mirror and recognizing the woman looking back at me, not with perfection, but with respect. At 67 years old, I finally learned to live. And nobody, absolutely nobody, will ever tell me again I've already lived too much. Because as long as my heart beats, I still have stories to live, dreams to accomplish, and a whole life to call my own. And so ends this emotional story of pain, overcoming, and rebirth. A real story of an elderly mother who was humiliated, discarded, treated like a burden by her own ungrateful son and by a gold-digger daughter-in-law, but who found strength where she didn't even imagine it existed, who chose to live for herself for the first time in decades, and who proved it's never, ever too late to start over. The total humiliation I suffered almost destroyed me, but in the end it rebuilt me in a way I never imagined possible. Today, I know that living doesn't have an expiration date, and that as long as there's breath, there's life to be lived with dignity and purpose. And you, have you been through something similar? Have you felt discarded by someone you loved? Did you have to rebuild your life from scratch after a big disappointment? What would you do if you were in my place? Would you forgive completely or keep your distance? How would you react if your own son said you'd already lived too much? Tell me here in the comments. I really want to know your opinion and your experiences. Your story can help other people going through the same thing. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss other emotional stories that bring life lessons and make us reflect on our own choices and relationships. Every week I bring real stories of overcoming, forgiveness, justice, and new beginnings that'll move you and make you think about what really matters in life. You're not alone in your struggles, and these stories are here to prove it. Until the next story, and remember, you've never lived too much as long as there's still life in you.